Sarah Chen stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, her frame so slight that military uniforms hung loose on her shoulders, despite being the smallest size available. At 24, she looked even younger, with delicate features that made people mistake her for a teenager rather than a trained soldier. The other recruits at Fort Bragg had nicknamed her Pixie during basic training, a name that followed her through advanced infantry school and into her first deployment. The military dining hall buzzed with conversation as Sarah carried her tray to an empty table. Around her, soldiers twice her size dominated the space with their booming voices and confident swagger. She had learned to navigate these environments carefully, keeping her head down and avoiding unnecessary attention. Experience had taught her that standing out usually meant becoming a target for jokes or dismissive comments about her appearance. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a towering 6'4" infantry officer, noticed her sitting alone and nudged his companions. "Look at that little thing over there," he said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I swear the recruitment standards keep getting lower. What's she going to do in combat, hide behind a tree?" His comment sparked laughter from his group, drawing more attention to Sarah's corner of the dining hall. Sarah continued eating methodically, her expression unchanged. She had heard variations of this conversation countless times throughout her military career. The assumptions were always the same. Someone her size couldn't possibly be effective in combat situations. People looked at her and saw weakness, vulnerability, someone who needed protection, rather than someone capable of providing it. What these soldiers didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 3 years in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. While they were stationed at comfortable bases with regular supply lines and backup support, she had been operating in remote mountain villages where the enemy knew every rock and cave. Her small stature, which seemed like such a disadvantage to her critics, had actually become one of her greatest assets in the field. The laughter from Lieutenant Webb's table grew louder as more soldiers joined their conversation about recruitment standards and physical requirements. Sarah finished her meal and stood to leave, her movements quiet and efficient. As she walked past their table, she could hear fragments of their discussion about how the military was becoming soft by allowing people like her to serve in combat roles. Outside the dining hall, Sarah breathed in the cool evening air and adjusted her uniform. Tomorrow would bring another day of training exercises, where she would once again have to prove herself among soldiers who had already decided she didn't belong. The cycle had become familiar. Skeptical looks, whispered comments, and the constant need to demonstrate her capabilities to people who preferred to judge her by appearance rather than performance. What none of them realized was that Sarah's file contained information that would fundamentally change their perspective. Her service record included details that were classified at levels most of these soldiers would never reach. The missions she had completed, the situations she had navigated, and the results she had achieved painted a picture that contradicted every assumption they had made based on her physical appearance. As she walked back to her quarters, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. The very traits that made her colleagues underestimate her had been precisely what made her so effective in specialized operations. Her ability to move undetected, to appear harmless and non-threatening, had allowed her to gather intelligence and complete objectives that larger, more imposing soldiers could never have accomplished. The military had recognized her unique skills early in her career, leading to assignments that few soldiers ever received. She had worked with special operations units, intelligence agencies, and foreign military advisors in situations where conventional approaches had failed. Her success rate on these missions was remarkable, though the classified nature of her work meant that most people would never know the full extent of her contributions. Sarah knew that tomorrow would likely bring more of the same treatment she had experienced today. The soldiers would continue to judge her based on outdated stereotypes and limited understanding of what actually made someone effective in modern warfare. But she also knew that eventually, the truth had a way of revealing itself, often in ways that surprised everyone involved. The morning briefing room filled with the usual crowd of soldiers preparing for another day of tactical exercises. Sarah entered quietly and took a seat near the back, her notebook ready and pen poised to take notes. The training schedule indicated they would be working on urban warfare scenarios, something that required careful coordination and split-second decision-making. Lieutenant Webb dominated the front row with his group of followers, their conversation continuing from the previous evening's dining hall discussion. I'm telling you, they need to raise the physical standards, he said while adjusting his gear. How is someone that small going to carry a wounded soldier to safety? It's not about being mean, it's about practical reality. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had been listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. You know, Webb, sometimes the best soldiers come in unexpected packages. I've seen plenty of big guys freeze up when things get real. His comment earned a dismissive laugh from Webb's group, who clearly believed that physical size directly correlated with combat effectiveness. The briefing officer entered and called the room to attention. Major Thompson was a veteran with over 20 years of service, including multiple combat deployments. He had a reputation for being fair but demanding, someone who evaluated soldiers based on performance rather than appearance. As he began outlining the day's exercises, his eyes briefly met Sarah's, and she noticed a slight nod of acknowledgement. Today's scenario involves a hostage rescue operation in an urban environment, Major Thompson announced. You'll be working in teams of 4, with each team assigned specific objectives. The scenario is based on actual missions conducted in overseas operations, so treat this with the seriousness it deserves. He began reading off team assignments, carefully balancing experienced soldiers with newer personnel. When Sarah's name was called, she was assigned to a team that included Lieutenant Webb. The irony wasn't lost on her. She would be working directly with the person who had been most vocal about her perceived inadequacies. Webb's reaction was immediate and visible. His jaw tightened and he exchanged glances with his friends, clearly unhappy with the assignment. Ma'am. With respect, Webb addressed Major Thompson. Wouldn't it make more sense to put Chen with a support role rather than frontline operations? Given her physical limitations? His question was phrased diplomatically, but the underlying message was clear to everyone in the room. Major Thompson's expression remained neutral, but his tone carried a hint of steel. Lieutenant Webb, I assign personnel based on their qualifications and service records, not their appearance. I suggest you focus on completing the mission rather than questioning my decisions. The room fell silent, and Webb's face reddened slightly as he realized his comment had been inappropriate. As teams gathered to plan their approaches, Sarah found herself in an awkward position. Her 3 teammates, Webb, Corporal Johnson, and Private Martinez, were clearly uncertain about how to incorporate her into their strategy. They discussed entry points, cover positions, and assault tactics while she listened, waiting for an opportunity to contribute. Look, Chen, Webb finally said, no offense, but this is going to be intense. Maybe you should handle communications while we take care of the actual breach and clear operations. His suggestion was met with nods from the other team members, who seemed relieved to have found a way to minimize her involvement in the dangerous aspects of the mission. Sarah considered her response carefully. She could accept the role they were offering and avoid conflict, or she could push back and insist on being treated as an equal team member. Her experience told her that proving herself through actions was more effective than arguing with words. I understand your concerns, she said calmly, but I think I might be more useful than you realize. Why don't we review the building layout first? As she spread out the floor plans and began analyzing the target structure, Sarah's knowledge of urban warfare tactics became apparent. She identified potential ambush points, suggested alternative entry routes, and highlighted areas where their larger team members might struggle to maneuver effectively. Her insights were practical and based on real-world experience, though she didn't elaborate on where that experience had come from. Despite her valuable input, the underlying tension remained. Webb and the others acknowledged her tactical knowledge, but continued to view her as a liability when it came to actual combat operations. They couldn't reconcile her small stature with their preconceptions about what a soldier should look like and how they should perform under pressure. The exercise was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, giving each team time to finalize their plans and prepare their equipment. As Sarah checked her gear, she reflected on the countless similar situations she had faced throughout her career. The pattern was always the same: doubt, skepticism, and eventual surprise when reality contradicted expectations. Today would likely be no different, except that this time her performance would be witnessed by a larger group of soldiers who shared Webb's prejudices. The urban warfare training facility resembled a small city block, complete with multi-story buildings, narrow alleyways, and realistic interior layouts. Safety officers positioned themselves at strategic points while medics stood ready for any training accidents. The exercise would be conducted with simulation ammunition, but the scenarios were designed to be as realistic as possible. Sarah's team gathered at their designated starting position, reviewing their plan one final time. Webb had assigned himself as team leader, with Johnson and Martinez handling the primary assault while Sarah remained in a support role. The objective was to rescue 2 hostages held on the second floor of the central building, while neutralizing any threats they encountered. Remember, this is about speed and precision. Webb addressed his team. We go in hard and fast, secure the hostages, and get out. Chen, you stay behind us and call out anything we might miss. His instructions reinforced the protective role he had assigned to her, treating her more like an observer than a participant. The whistle sounded, signaling the start of the exercise. Teams from different starting points began moving toward their objectives, their movements monitored by instructors with clipboards and stopwatches. Sarah's team advanced toward their target building, using available cover to avoid being detected by the opposing force role players. As they approached the building's entrance, Webb signaled for his team to stack up against the wall. The plan called for a dynamic entry through the front door, with Johnson taking point and Martinez providing cover. Sarah positioned herself as directed, several feet behind the others, ready to follow once they had secured the initial breach. The entry went smoothly, with Johnson quickly clearing the first room while Martinez covered the stairwell. However, as they moved deeper into the building, the limitations of their approach became apparent. The narrow hallways and tight corners that characterized urban environments created challenges that their straightforward assault plan hadn't adequately addressed. Webb's larger frame made it difficult for him to navigate quickly through doorways, while Johnson struggled to maintain proper sightlines in the confined spaces. When they encountered their first opposition role player, their movements became awkward and uncoordinated as they tried to maneuver around each other in the cramped environment. Sarah watched from her position, recognizing tactical opportunities that her teammates were missing. Her experience in similar real-world situations had taught her to read building layouts differently, identifying advantages that larger soldiers often overlooked. But her assigned role kept her from acting on these insights. As the team moved up to the second floor, they encountered a more complex scenario. Multiple opposition role players had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire, effectively trapping Webb's team in a narrow hallway. Their size and conventional approach made them easy targets, and within minutes, both Johnson and Martinez had been marked as casualties by the exercise referees. Webb found himself pinned down behind inadequate cover, unable to advance or retreat effectively. The opposition role players had positioned themselves expertly, using the building's architecture to their advantage. From her position, Sarah could see several potential solutions, but her teammates had made it clear that they expected her to remain in a passive role. The situation deteriorated quickly as Webb attempted to force his way through using brute force rather than tactical finesse. His approach was exactly what the opposition expected, allowing them to maintain their advantage while the clock continued to tick. The hostage rescue scenario had a strict time limit, and valuable minutes were being wasted on ineffective tactics. Finally, Sarah made a decision that would change the dynamic of the entire exercise. Instead of waiting for further instructions or permission, she moved independently, using her small size to navigate through areas that her larger teammates couldn't access. She identified a maintenance shaft that connected to an adjacent room, providing an unexpected angle of approach. Her movement was swift and silent, demonstrating skills that surprised the exercise observers. She navigated the building's hidden passages with the confidence of someone who had done this type of work before, though under very different circumstances. Within minutes, she had repositioned herself behind the opposition role players, creating a tactical advantage that her team could exploit. The opposition force, focused on Webb's frontal assault, was completely unprepared for Sarah's flanking maneuver. Her precise movements and timing allowed her to neutralize 2 role players before they realized what was happening. The sudden shift in the tactical situation gave Webb the opening he needed to advance and complete the primary objective. What had seemed like an impossible situation was resolved in minutes once Sarah took an active role. Her unconventional approach, made possible by her size and agility, demonstrated capabilities that her teammates hadn't even considered. The exercise concluded successfully, with the hostages rescued and the opposition force neutralized. But the real revelation was just beginning. As the teams gathered for the after-action review, whispers began spreading among the other soldiers who had witnessed Sarah's performance. The person they had dismissed as inadequate had just demonstrated skills that exceeded those of more experienced soldiers. The question now was whether this would change their perceptions or if they would find other ways to explain away what they had seen. The after-action review took place in the same briefing room where the day had begun, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Soldiers who had been dismissive of Sarah just hours earlier now watched her with curious expressions, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with their preconceptions. Major Thompson stood at the front of the room, reviewing notes from the exercise observers. Team 4's performance was particularly interesting, Major Thompson began, addressing Webb's group directly. Lieutenant Webb, can you walk us through what happened when your team encountered the opposition force on the second floor? His question carried a neutral tone, but everyone in the room understood that this was more than a routine debrief. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly struggling with how to explain the events. We encountered a well-positioned enemy force that had us pinned down, he admitted. Our initial approach wasn't working and we were taking casualties. Then he paused, glancing at Sarah before continuing. Chen took initiative and found an alternative route that allowed us to complete the mission. The room remained silent as soldiers processed this information. Many of them had observed parts of the exercise, but hearing Webb acknowledge Sarah's contribution directly was significant. His tone lacked the dismissive quality that had characterized his earlier comments, replaced by something that might have been grudging respect. Major Thompson nodded and consulted his notes again. The exercise observers noted some exceptional tactical decision-making from Specialist Chen. Her ability to quickly assess the building layout and identify unconventional approach routes was impressive. He looked directly at Sarah as he spoke. That kind of spatial awareness and tactical flexibility typically comes from extensive experience. Where did you develop those skills? Sarah considered her response carefully. Her actual experience was classified, involving missions that most of the soldiers in this room would never be cleared to know about. I've had opportunities to work in various environments, sir. You learn to adapt when conventional approaches don't work. Her answer was truthful but deliberately vague, leaving room for interpretation. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had defended Sarah earlier, spoke up from his position near the middle of the room. I think what we saw today demonstrates why we shouldn't make assumptions based on appearance. Combat effectiveness comes in many forms, and sometimes the most valuable asset is someone who can do what others can't. His comment sparked murmurs throughout the room as soldiers began discussing what they had witnessed. Some remained skeptical, suggesting that Sarah had simply gotten lucky or that the exercise scenario had played to her advantages. Others were beginning to reconsider their initial judgments, recognizing that her performance had been too skilled and deliberate to be explained by luck alone. Private Martinez, who had been part of Sarah's team, raised his hand to speak. Sir, I was there when it happened. Chen didn't just find an alternative route. She read that building like she'd been studying it for weeks. She knew exactly where to go and how to position herself for maximum effectiveness. That wasn't beginner's luck. The discussion continued as more soldiers shared their observations from the exercise. Some noted how Sarah's movements had been economical and purposeful, lacking the hesitation that typically characterized soldiers working in unfamiliar environments. Others mentioned her tactical communication, which had been precise and professional throughout the operation. Webb found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the conversation progressed. His public criticism of Sarah's capabilities now seemed not just wrong, but potentially embarrassing. The soldiers who had been agreeing with his assessment just hours earlier were now questioning their own judgment based on what they had witnessed. What I don't understand, said Corporal Harrison from another team, is why someone with those kinds of skills isn't already in a leadership position. The way she handled that situation showed more tactical awareness than I've seen from some of our senior personnel. His observation prompted nods of agreement from several other soldiers. Major Thompson allowed the discussion to continue for several more minutes before calling for attention. What happened today should serve as a reminder that effective soldiers come in many forms. Physical appearance is just one factor among many, and often not the most important one. I encourage all of you to focus on performance and capability, rather than making assumptions based on stereotypes. As the briefing concluded and soldiers began filing out of the room, the conversations continued in smaller groups. Sarah found herself in an unusual position. Instead of being ignored or dismissed, soldiers were approaching her with questions about tactics and techniques. The shift in attitude was dramatic and immediate. Webb lingered near his seat as the room emptied, clearly wanting to say something but struggling with how to approach her. When most of the other soldiers had left, he finally walked over to where Sarah was gathering her notes. "Look, Chen," he began, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "I owe you an apology. I made some assumptions that were clearly wrong." Sarah looked up at him, her expression neutral but not hostile. "Apology accepted, Lieutenant. We all make mistakes based on incomplete information." Her response was professional and gracious, avoiding any opportunity to make him feel worse about his error in judgment. The conversation might have ended there, but Webb seemed compelled to continue. "Can I ask you something? Where did you really learn to fight like that? Because what I saw today wasn't basic training or even advanced infantry school. That was something else entirely." His curiosity was genuine, reflecting a desire to understand rather than challenge. Sarah's smile was enigmatic as she shouldered her pack and prepared to leave. "Sometimes the best training comes from unexpected places, Lieutenant. The important thing is being ready when the situation requires it." With that, she walked toward the door, leaving Webb with more questions than answers about the soldier he had so severely underestimated. The next few days brought a noticeable change in how other soldiers interacted with Sarah. The dismissive comments and condescending looks had been replaced by curious glances and respectful nods. Word of her performance during the urban warfare exercise had spread throughout the base, creating a buzz of speculation about her background and experience. During morning physical training, soldiers who had previously ignored her began including her in their conversations. They asked questions about tactics, sought her opinions on equipment choices, and generally treated her as someone whose expertise was worth considering. The transformation was remarkable, though Sarah remained cautious about reading too much into it. Lieutenant Webb found himself in an increasingly awkward position as more details about the exercise circulated among the troops. His public criticism of Sarah's capabilities had been witnessed by dozens of soldiers, and his subsequent need to rely on her skills during the mission created an uncomfortable contrast. Some of his former supporters were beginning to question his judgment in other areas as, well, the situation came to a head during a routine training meeting. When Webb attempted to reassert his authority by questioning Sarah's tactical suggestions for an upcoming field exercise. "I appreciate Chen's input," he said with forced diplomatic tone, "but we need to be realistic about what works in actual combat situations versus controlled training environments." Sergeant Rodriguez immediately challenged this comment. "With respect, Lieutenant, what we saw during the urban warfare exercise was exactly the kind of adaptability that saves lives in real combat. Maybe we should be asking Chen to share more of her insights rather than dismissing them." His support carried weight with the other soldiers, many of whom had come to similar conclusions. The tension in the room was palpable as soldiers found themselves choosing sides in what had become more than just a disagreement about tactics. Webb's credibility as a leader was being questioned, while Sarah's reputation continued to grow despite her efforts to remain low-key about her capabilities. Major Thompson entered the meeting room just as the discussion was reaching a peak. He quickly assessed the situation and decided to address it directly, rather than allowing the conflict to fester. "I can see there are some strong opinions being expressed here. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss what makes an effective soldier and leader." He gestured for everyone to take their seats and assumed his position at the front of the room. "I've been watching the dynamics in this unit since the urban warfare exercise, and I think there are some important lessons to be learned. The most obvious one is that we need to evaluate people based on their actual performance rather than our assumptions about what they can do." Major Thompson's comments were clearly directed at the broader group, but Webb understood that his behavior was being specifically addressed. The major continued, I've seen too many good soldiers overlooked because they didn't fit someone's preconceived notion of what a warrior should look like. I've also seen overconfident soldiers put others at risk because they couldn't admit when someone else had better ideas. The room remained silent as soldiers absorbed the implications of these statements. Sarah sat quietly, neither defending herself nor attacking Webb, allowing the situation to unfold without her direct intervention. Her restraint was noted by everyone present, adding to the growing respect for her professionalism. "I'm going to share something with you that might provide some context for recent events," Major Thompson announced, producing a folder from his briefcase. "Specialist Chen's service record contains information that was previously classified, but given recent developments, I've received permission to share some details with this unit." The announcement created an immediate buzz of anticipation throughout the room. Classified service records were unusual for regular infantry soldiers, typically reserved for special operations personnel or those involved in sensitive intelligence work. Everyone leaned forward, suddenly very interested in what the Major was about to reveal. Specialist Chen has completed 3 deployments in Afghanistan, working with special operations units conducting high-risk missions in hostile territory. Major Thompson began reading from the file. Her assignments included deep reconnaissance, target identification, and liaison work with local intelligence assets. She has been decorated for valor on 2 separate occasions. The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Soldiers exchanged glances of surprise and embarrassment as they realized how dramatically they had misjudged their colleague. Webb's face went pale as the full implications of his behavior became clear. He had been criticizing someone whose combat experience far exceeded his own. Major Thompson continued reading selected portions of Sarah's record, carefully avoiding the most sensitive details, while providing enough information to establish her credentials. Her commanding officers consistently noted her exceptional tactical awareness, ability to operate independently in dangerous environments, and success rate on critical missions. One evaluation described her as an invaluable asset whose unconventional approach consistently produces results that traditional methods cannot achieve. The silence in the room was profound as soldiers processed this information. Many of them were experiencing their first deployment, while others had served in relatively safe rear area positions. None of them had the kind of combat experience that Sarah's record indicated, making their previous dismissal of her capabilities seem not just wrong but almost ridiculous. Webb stared at his hands, clearly struggling with the realization that he had publicly questioned someone whose qualifications made his own seem minimal by comparison. The soldier he had nicknamed Pixie and suggested should handle communications rather than combat operations had actually been conducting missions that most soldiers could only imagine. As the implications settled in, the atmosphere in the room shifted once again. The respect that had been building since the urban warfare exercise transformed into something approaching awe. These soldiers were beginning to understand that they had been in the presence of someone truly exceptional, someone whose modest demeanor had concealed extraordinary experience and capability. The revelation about Sarah's classified service record created ripple effects throughout the base that extended far beyond the soldiers who had been present at the briefing. Word spread quickly through informal networks, transforming the narrative around the small soldier who had been consistently underestimated by her peers. Soldiers who had never spoken to Sarah began approaching her with questions about her experiences, though she remained diplomatically vague about the specific details of her missions. Her responses were professional and modest, neither confirming nor denying the more dramatic rumors that were beginning to circulate about her background. Webb found himself in an impossible position. His public criticism of Sarah had been witnessed by dozens of soldiers, and the subsequent revelation of her combat record made his comments appear not just wrong, but potentially damaging to unit morale and cohesion. Some soldiers were beginning to question his leadership abilities and judgment in other areas as well. The situation became more complicated when Colonel Harrison, the base commander, requested a meeting with Major Thompson about the recent developments in the training unit. Word had reached his office about the unusual circumstances surrounding Sarah's service record and the impact it was having on unit dynamics. Colonel Harrison was a seasoned military officer with over 30 years of service, including multiple combat deployments and command positions. He had a reputation for being fair but demanding, someone who evaluated situations based on facts rather than politics or personalities. His interest in Sarah's case went beyond simple curiosity about an unusual personnel situation. "I've been reviewing Specialist Chen's complete service record," Colonel Harrison told Major Thompson during their private meeting. The classified portions make for interesting reading. Her work with special operations units produced results that significantly impacted mission success rates in her area of operations. Some of her achievements are quite remarkable. Major Thompson nodded, having suspected that the information he had been authorized to share represented only a fraction of Sarah's actual accomplishments. "Her performance during training exercises has been exceptional, sir. The other soldiers are beginning to recognize her capabilities, though it took some time for them to look past their initial assumptions." The colonel leaned back in his chair, considering the implications of the situation. "I'm particularly interested in the incident with Lieutenant Webb. His initial assessment of Chen's capabilities was not just wrong, but potentially harmful to unit effectiveness. How has he responded to learning about her actual background?" This question touched on one of Major Thompson's primary concerns about the ongoing situation. Webb's leadership credibility had been significantly damaged by his public misjudgment of Sarah's abilities. The other soldiers were watching carefully to see how he would handle the revelation, and his response would likely affect his future effectiveness as an officer. "Lieutenant Webb is struggling with the situation, sir," Major Thompson admitted. "He's attempting to rebuild his credibility with the troops, but his initial comments about Chen were fairly public and definitive. Some soldiers are questioning his judgment in other areas as a result." Colonel Harrison had seen similar situations throughout his career, where officers made assumptions that proved embarrassingly wrong when additional information became available. The military's hierarchical structure meant that such mistakes could have lasting consequences for both leadership effectiveness and unit morale. "I think it's time for a broader discussion about this situation," the colonel decided. "I want you to arrange a meeting with all the soldiers involved in the recent training exercises. It's important that we address this directly, rather than allowing rumors and speculation to continue affecting unit cohesion." The announcement of an all-hands meeting with the colonel created immediate buzz throughout the affected units. Soldiers understood that such meetings were reserved for significant issues, and everyone involved in the recent events began speculating about what the colonel intended to address. Sarah received word of the meeting with mixed feelings. She had spent her entire military career trying to avoid the kind of attention that this situation was generating. Her effectiveness had always depended partly on being underestimated, and the growing awareness of her capabilities threatened to eliminate that advantage in future assignments. Webb approached the meeting with considerable anxiety, knowing that his handling of the Sarah situation would likely be scrutinized by the highest levels of command. His career prospects could be significantly affected by how the colonel viewed his judgment and leadership during this incident. As soldiers filed into the base's main briefing auditorium, the atmosphere was tense with anticipation. Many of them had never been in a meeting with the colonel, and the formal setting emphasized the seriousness of the situation. Sarah took a seat toward the back of the room, hoping to maintain her preferred low profile. When Colonel Harrison entered the auditorium, the assembled soldiers immediately came to attention. His presence commanded respect, and his expression suggested that he had serious matters to discuss. As he gestured for everyone to be seated, soldiers throughout the room prepared themselves for what would prove to be a defining moment in their understanding of military service and leadership. The colonel's opening remarks would set the tone for a discussion that would fundamentally change how these soldiers thought about capability, judgment, and the importance of looking beyond superficial appearances when evaluating their colleagues and subordinates. Colonel Harrison stood at the podium, his weathered face showing the experience of 3 decades in military service. The auditorium fell completely silent as over 200 soldiers waited for him to speak. His reputation preceded him, fair but uncompromising, someone who had earned respect through competence rather than rank alone. "I've called this meeting to address some recent events that have important implications for how we operate as a military unit," the colonel began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room. "Specifically, I want to discuss the assumptions we make about our fellow soldiers and how those assumptions can affect our effectiveness and readiness. He gestured toward the front row where Major Thompson sat with the key personnel involved in recent training exercises. Some of you have learned valuable lessons about the danger of judging people based on appearance rather than capability. Others may still be processing what these revelations mean for your understanding of military service. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, knowing that his role in the situation was about to be examined publicly. Around him, soldiers who had shared his initial skepticism about Sarah found themselves equally uncomfortable as they anticipated the colonel's analysis of their behavior. Let me share something with you about Specialist Chen's service record, Colonel Harrison continued, producing a thick folder that he placed on the podium. The information I'm about to share has been declassified specifically for this discussion, because I believe it's important for you to understand what real combat effectiveness looks like. The auditorium remained absolutely silent as the colonel opened the folder and began reading. Specialist Chen has completed 47 high-risk missions in Afghanistan over 3 deployments. Her success rate is 100%. Every mission she was assigned was completed successfully, often under circumstances where previous attempts by other personnel had failed. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience as soldiers began to comprehend the magnitude of Sarah's experience. Many of them had never been on a single combat mission, while others had participated in routine patrols that seemed insignificant by comparison. Her mission types included deep reconnaissance in enemy territory, target identification for special operations strikes, intelligence gathering from human sources, and direct action missions against high-value targets, the colonel continued. On 2 separate occasions, she was the sole survivor of operations that went wrong, managing to complete her objectives and extract critical intelligence despite being isolated behind enemy lines. The weight of these revelations settled over the auditorium like a physical presence. Soldiers turned to look at Sarah, sitting quietly in the back row, trying to reconcile this description with the small, unassuming person they thought they knew. Her expression remained neutral, neither proud nor embarrassed by the public disclosure of her achievements. Colonel Harrison closed the folder and stepped away from the podium, walking closer to his audience. The reason I'm sharing this information is not to embarrass anyone or to praise Specialist Chen, though her service certainly deserves recognition. I'm sharing it because what happened here represents a failure of leadership and judgment that could have serious consequences in combat situations. His eyes found Webb in the crowd, and the lieutenant seemed to shrink under the colonel's direct gaze. When we allow preconceptions and stereotypes to override our assessment of personnel capabilities, we create vulnerabilities that our enemies can exploit. More importantly, we waste the talents and experience of soldiers who could be making crucial contributions to our mission success. The colonel's tone became more serious as he addressed the broader implications of the situation. In combat, the soldier next to you might be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. If you've already decided that person is inadequate based on their appearance, you've compromised your own survival and the survival of your unit. He paused to let this sink in before continuing. Specialist Chen's small stature and unassuming appearance weren't disadvantages in her previous assignments. They were her greatest assets. Her ability to blend in, to appear non-threatening, to move undetected through hostile environments made her uniquely valuable for missions that larger, more traditionally imposing soldiers couldn't accomplish. The auditorium was so quiet that the sound of air conditioning seemed loud. Soldiers were processing not just the information about Sarah's service record, but the broader lessons about judgment, leadership, and the complexity of modern warfare. Going forward, I expect this unit to evaluate personnel based on performance, capability, and contribution to mission success, Colonel Harrison stated firmly. Anyone who continues to make decisions based on superficial characteristics rather than demonstrated competence will find themselves reassigned to positions where they're poor. Judgment can't endanger others. As he concluded his remarks, the colonel's expression softened slightly.
Specialist Chen, would you please stand?
Sarah rose from her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but complying with the request. Your service to this country has been exemplary, and your contributions to mission success in some of our most challenging operational environments deserve recognition from every soldier in this room. The applause that erupted was spontaneous and sustained, growing in intensity as soldiers throughout the auditorium rose to their feet. Sarah stood quietly, accepting the recognition with the same dignity she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. When the applause finally died down, she simply nodded respectfully to the colonel and resumed her seat. Colonel Harrison returned to the podium for his final remarks. The lessons learned here should stay with all of you throughout your military careers and beyond. Real strength comes in many forms, and the most effective warriors are often those who don't fit our preconceived notions of what they should look like or how they should act. As the meeting concluded and soldiers began filing out of the auditorium, the conversations were subdued and thoughtful. The dramatic revelations had fundamentally changed how many of them thought about their profession and their colleagues. Webb remained in his seat long after others had left, staring at the podium where his assumptions had been so thoroughly dismantled. Sarah walked quietly toward the exit, surrounded by a respectful space that her fellow soldiers now maintained not out of dismissal, but out of genuine respect for someone whose achievements had redefined their understanding of what it meant to be an elite soldier. The laughter that had once followed her through the halls was now replaced by something far more valuable: the hard-earned respect of those who finally understood who she really was.